Michael. Okay, so the topic today really falls within two disparate and yet related themes, both of which have been published. The first one, as you very well know, is weakness and faithless polity. We've already had a series of 4 lectures prior to this, and this falls within that category. You will recall the first of the lectures we had was given by Mark Beaumont, who was one of our scholars years ago, completed in 2003, to focus on Muslim-Christian relations in the 9th century, followed by Gordon Nichols' excellent lecture, which focused on the similar theme in the context of South Asia. And the third lecture was by one of our own scholars, once again, Kai Wisdom, who looked at Asia's hospitable democracy. And the last one was by Ishaq Gattas, originally from Egypt, but living and working in the context of Europe, particularly in Belgium. He looked at Sharia interpretations in daily lives of ordinary people in the city of Brussels. And this is the final lecture in that series. The second theme, within which Bishop Michael's lecture fits very well, is Christianity in Transforming States. And this is the volume that contains another of Bishop Michael's papers, written in collaboration with one of his students, Amir, who's currently completing his amendments, and has really no time to participate in this lecture, as you can imagine. He was awarded subject minor corrections, so he should be completing his corrections very soon. So, Bishop Michael, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to be part of this series and for presenting this lecture. I call him Bishop Michael only because of the force of habit. Obviously, lots of things have changed in his life. He has been a bishop in the Diocese of Rochester for nearly 15 years. Prior to that, in Raiwind in Pakistan. He's been the General Secretary, not Executive Director of CMS for many years. He's had close links with OCMS going all the way back to the 80s, as far as I know. And I consider him to be a close friend and a mentor to me. Had the privilege of working closely with him in supervising students, in examining students, and through this process of working collaboratively with him. And on this book, I have learned obviously a lot from him. So over to you, Bishop Michael. You've got 40, 50 minutes maybe, which should be sufficient, and then there'll be sufficient time for our discussion or questions, etc.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Singh. You're very generous, as always, not only with your time, but your expertise. What would we do without you? This topic about Iran is a difficult one to tackle because there are so many different aspects to it, and I'm sure that I will leave some out. Dr. Sarah Afshari is here, and I'm sure she will be able to complement what I say and to fill in what I leave out. History is very long. So already I've listed some of the dynasties in Iran. The first of these, the Achaemenid, you will know about because the founder of this dynasty was... Who was the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty? It was Cyrus, wasn't it? It was Cyrus the Persian who overturned the rule of Babylon, allowed the people of Israel to return home, and then some of his successors also were engaged in the rebuilding of the temple. So the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Bible are about that, and none of that would have happened without the Armenians actually being actively involved in what was happening. With the New Testament, the very beginnings of the church are associated with Persia because there are at least three peoples mentioned on the day of Pentecost who are from Persia: the Parthians, the Medes, and the Elamites. So from different parts of Persia, the Parthians more to the north, the Elamites more to the south, and the Medes more to the west. Yeah, I think it is the west, the southwest. That's from day one. Historically speaking, it seems that the church arrived in Persia from the north and the west, from the boundary with the Roman Empire. It seems already in the 2nd century. And this church under Persian rule, which of course at that time extended right up to Syria and to what is now Turkey, which was then Byzantium. This church under Persian rule acquired a certain kind of character to it, and I refer to it. But for example, one of the oldest Eucharistic prayers that the church has is called the prayer of Adai and Mari. This is a unique Eucharistic prayer because it does not have the words of the institution. And so for a long time, it was regarded, for example, by the Catholic Church as deficient because it didn't have the words of the institution. But recently, the Catholic Church has accepted that this prayer is entirely in accordance even with Catholic teaching, because although it does not have the words of the institution, the words of Christ himself, the intention is there to have. This church also acquired a special character when Nestorius was first condemned at the Council of Ephesus in 431 and expelled. And then later on, this was consolidated by the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And so many Persian Christians who had at first fled persecution to go into the Roman Empire and set up a famous school there in Edessa, then came back to the Persian Empire and set up a very famous school called the School of Nisibis, which was imitated all over the world in its curriculum, for example, and its teaching methods and so on. Under the Parthians, the dynasty that succeeded the Achaemenians, there was very little persecution of the church as far as we know. I mean, there are the odd incidents. The history, the definitive history of the church in the Persian Empire is this one, Patriarch Shah and Caliph, by Bishop William Young, who was the Bishop of Sialkot in Pakistan. It's his PhD dissertation from the University of Edinburgh. And he records one or two isolated incidents of persecution under the Parthians. But then the Parthians were replaced by the Sasanians. And at first, the Sasanians were much more aware of their religious identity as rooted in Zoroastrianism. At first, there was little persecution as far as we know. And then Constantine happened. Let's put it like that. Whatever happened. And Constantine wrote a letter to the then Shah, the King of Kings, the Emperor, who was then Shapur II, urging Shapur II to protect his Christian subjects. Well, you might think that was a good thing to happen, and it was, until war broke out between the Romans and the Persians. So when war broke out in 337 between the Romans and the Persians, then the Christians became suspected fifth column, as aiding and abetting, whether rightly or wrongly, the Roman Empire, which was becoming Christian at that time, whatever you mean by that. And so very serious persecution broke out in the Persian Empire. I was once traveling across northern Kurdistan, which is now in Iraq, of course. It's part of the Persian Empire. And I saw groups of people celebrating. So I said to my driver, what are they doing? And he said, oh, they are Christian, it is their big feast. So I said, well, what feast? Please stop. Anyway, I stopped. I discovered the Syrian Catholic Bishop there. And so I said, what feast is it? And he said, it is the feast of the martyrs who were martyred under Shahpur II. Mm-hmm. So they're still observing the feast. So I joined them and he showed me some of the tombs and so on. The patriarch or the Catholicos of the church, Shemaun, well, he was made to watch the martyrdom of his priests and his bishops, and then he was martyred himself. Church property was confiscated, and not just property, but also the books and the vessels, the sacred vessels, and so on were desecrated. So it was a very hard time for the church. And I think it is fair to say that although especially after the Council of Ephesus, the church of the East, as it was called, still called, although it had very little to do with the Roman Empire and was doctrinally different from the West. I mean, the West in this context means the Middle East, in the western part of the Middle East. It doesn't mean Europe, of which there was very little awareness. Although it had very little to do with the Roman Empire, actually when war broke out, which was from time to time the case, then the Christians immediately became suspect. However, in 410, under the Emperor Yazdegerd, sorry, I'm trying to write some of these things down. I've already filled up this. Toleration was finally announced, declared. The decree, the Yazdegerd's decree or edict in 410 is very closely parallel to the Edict of Milan, of the decree of Constantine proclaiming toleration for Christians and religious liberty. Both, not just for Christians. In this decree, for the first time, at least as far as I know, what had been true of the Jewish community was now extended to the Christians. So they became, and this is a term that the Persians have given to the word millat. They became a recognized community. Of course, in return to certain restrictions of loyalty and so on to the Shah and Shah, to the crown. But their property was guaranteed. The bishops were appointed by them, but they had to have the approval of the Shah in doing so and so on. This is a landmark edict because, of course, this idea of the millat was then used by the Ottomans much later on to define communities within the Ottoman Empire. Then, of course, we have the coming of Islam. to Persia and the rapidity with which it overtook the Persian Empire and destroyed it. Already in the 7th century, for some time, the territories that we now know as Persia or Iran were governed by the various caliphates. But in the later period of the Abbasid Caliphate, Iran seems to have disintegrated into mutually isolated fiefdoms and tribes without any kind of central governing structure. There is also the very significant incursion of people from Central Asia, the Turks and then the Mongols. The Turkish tribes remain a constant feature in the history of Iran. They are constantly involved in the making of kings, the unmaking of kings, intrigue and so forth, both from the north and from the northeast. One of the Turkish tribes, for example, was the Afshar tribe, from which presumably you are descended. Afshari name of Afshar. So, but there are so many. I mean, it's not Sarah is not unique in this. From the north, the Afshar, I think, were in the northeast.
Yes, another Shah.
Shumal Afshar, yes.
Yeah.
This continued until a dynasty began to emerge. And its emergence is quite interesting because it is first rooted in a Sufi order. The Sufis were the mystics of Islam. And the first of these people, Safiuddin, was a Sufi leader actually. And he had reputation as a Sufi leader. But gradually his followers and he himself began to develop political ambitions. And these ambitions were strongly supported by a Turkish tribe that had converted to Shia Islam. Until now, as far as we know, most of Iran was Sunni. So what you have then is this emerging dynasty converted in exile, where they had taken refuge with the Shia tribe, to Shiism, who then assumed power under one of their rulers called Ismail the Great. There were several Ismails, so you have to specify which one. And this leads to the establishment of the Safavid dynasty, which was, Iran was identified with this dynasty in the eyes of Europe, for example, for a very long time. And many of the great artifacts that you may find in Sotheby's or Christie's are from this Safavid period, a great period of the flourishing of the arts, for example. The best known ruler of the Safavids was Shah Abbas, who was a very able administrator, warrior, and who united the country into more or less how we see it today. He was also a very insecure person, very strange, such a strong ruler, but he had a very insecure family background. And this led him to be very cruel, also, even to his own family. I won't go into the details, but the details are horrendous of how he dealt with his own father, whom he had deposed, and his brother. The Safavids were in contact with Europe and very strange kinds of behavior, because on the one hand, they were constantly campaigning against Georgia, the Kingdom of Georgia, and bringing large numbers of Georgian slaves who were converted to Islam and then press ganged into the armed forces, and also the Armenians. So on the one hand, these people were being made Muslims. On the other hand, some Georgian Christians and Armenians were actually settled as Christians in different parts of Iran. So New Jolfa, near Isfahan, actually comes from that time when Shah Abbas settled the Armenians there, and the Georgians near Mazandaran in the north. He also permitted some Western Catholic religious orders to work in Iran. The Carmelites, much of what we know about Shah Abbas is actually from Carmelite reports. The Dominicans, and the Safavids began to decline. Partly, it has to be said, because of Russian and British intrigue. I mean, this idea of Britain as a little Satan is very deep rooted in Iranian psychology, because Britain's main interest was, I think you have to be frank, Britain's main interest was to protect India. So whatever they did in Iran was to prevent Russia achieving influence in India. So many things were done. But the net result of some of this was the emergence of another Turkish origin dynasty, the Qajars, who ruled from the end of the 18th century to the beginning of the 20th. It was during this time that some of the institutions of Iran, modern institutions, began to be formed. There were various events marking this. For example, the resistance to tobacco concessions for the British by the religious leaders, which became a rallying point, to some extent similar to the Opium Wars in China. So the British were promoting these vices for commercial reasons, of course. But there was great resistance to this. And indeed to any kind of European influence, because the collecting of taxes had been given over to the Belgians by the Shah himself. And this was resisted by the ulama, because they said this is, selling our land to foreigners. Eventually, this resulted in a revolution, and the revolution resulted in a constitutional assembly, which in 1906 promulgated a constitution for Iran. That was the first kind of constitution that Iran has had. One of the provisions of this constitution was that any legislation passed by the Majlis, the parliament, would have to be scrutinized by a committee of 5 ulama, 5 religious leaders. Now, this is fateful, of course, for what happens in more recent periods. This constitution of 1906 survived throughout the 20th century until the Islamic Revolution. During the time of the Qajars, also Anglican and Protestant missions began to arrive. Presbyterians, for example. The Anglican mission, the first attempts were actually from what was then India. So Robert Bruce came from the Punjab to Iran. And then Bishop Thomas Valpy French, the famous Bishop of Lahore, after his retirement, came to Iran to baptize and confirm. And but the Anglican Church as such was not established until the 1880s, I think. The main commitment of CMS, which was behind many of these developments, was not to take members from the ancient churches, not to the Assyrian and the Armenian churches, the Chaldean, but to evangelize from the Muslim, Zoroastrian, and Jewish populations. So the makeup of the small Anglican church that came into existence was very largely that. It was largely of people who came from those backgrounds, not from the ancient churches of Iran. In the other churches, you do find some people from Armenian and Assyrian backgrounds. And then in the 20th century, we have the introduction of the Pentecostals, Assemblies of God particularly, introduced into Iran by two brothers who had studied here, I think, in this country, and went back and began what became a very, very important movement, remains a very important movement in Iran. There was relative freedom during the period of the Pahlavis. The Pahlavi was the last dynasty of Iran, of the last Shah's father and him. There was relative freedom for the churches to do their work. The Anglican Church in particular became over-dependent on institutions. So instead of evangelizing people directly, it became dependent on schools for the blind, for example, the famous hospital in Isfahan and other organizations. And when the revolution came, it may be that was one of the reasons why it fell under suspicion. But Dr. Sarah may have something to say about that. I think that, it's easy to say these things with hindsight, but the churches did not see generally what was coming. I mean, they were too complacent. When the revolution began to happen, of course, it was very broadly based. The revolution in Iran at first was not really an Islamic revolution. It was a revolution of which Islam was a part, but it was only a part. It was very broadly based. Many of the leaders, the first leaders, for example, Prime Minister Bazargan, was a remnant of the Mossadegh, the socialist government that had been overthrown by the conspiracy of the Americans and the British because it had nationalized the oil interests. I had a supervisor here who was in Oxford, who was actively involved in this overthrow as a British agent. Bani Sadr, for instance, there were many people of the Freedom, so-called Freedom Party, the Communist Party, the Tube. They were all involved in this, and indeed, many who were coming from the Islamic point of view were not theocrats. So many of the senior ayatollahs did not want theocratic government. And in fact, some of them, at the risk of their lives and their reputations, opposed it. What we can say Khomeini did very well was to use these people and then marginalize them one by one. So a constitutional assembly was announced, which was to be directly elected by the people. But that was then abruptly changed from being a Majlis-e-Musassiyan to being a Majlis-e-Khobregan, a committee of experts of just 75 people who had really been vetted and handpicked. Then the election was just a nominal thing. They produced a draft constitution, and at first, this assembly even was opposed to the marginalization of non-Muslims. So, for example, they wanted to retain the term hamwatan or citizen, common citizenship, rather than this term aqliyat or minority. But they did not prevail in many of the suggestions that they gave. In the end, the constitution was really the work of the Revolutionary Council, which heavily relied on Khomeini's own writings in producing what is now, this is the second constitution of Iran, I suppose. And many people like Bani Sadr actually preferred, and even Ali Shariati, another very important lay leader, they preferred the 1906 constitution because they said it got the balance right between the role of the fuqaha, of the Islamic legal experts, and of parliament. From our point of view, this constitution then identified certain minorities that were to be recognized and given certain rights, restricted rights. This concept of aqliyat was based on Khomeini's term, this term, kafir dhimmi. So you know that dhimmi means in Islam recognized peoples who are allowed to live within Islam under certain restrictions, and at first this was limited to the Jews and the Christians. Later on, it was extended to the Zoroastrians when Islam conquered the Persian Empire, and later on, even in northern India, to the Hindus and the Buddhists. But for Khomeini, kafir dhimmi means Christian, Jew, Zoroastrian. That's it. And these were the communities that are mentioned in the constitution as recognized minorities who could send a representative to parliament under a separate electorate system, who were allowed to worship but not allowed to propagate their faith. They were allowed to gather as long as any gathering was not seen as hostile to Islam. That was a condition that's in the constitution. So we have all of these minorities in Iran today, and although many have immigrated, of course, the Jewish people, there's still a large Jewish community in Iran, but quite heavily reduced now. However, I went to evening prayer at the synagogue in Tehran on a Tuesday, and it was jam-packed with men. The women came afterwards. The Chaldean Catholic Church is still there. Many of its priests are from the Syro-Malabar Church in India. It is sending seminarians to the Catholic seminary in Iraq, in Erbil. The Assyrian, the old Church of the East is still there. The Chaldeans, of course, are an offshoot of that church. And of course, the Armenians are there. However, what this did was to leave certain other significant groups unrecognized. And thereby hangs a tale. So, for instance, the Baha'is. the Baha'is have been the most persecuted community, I think it is fair to say, in Iran since the revolution, because they are seen as agents of Israel. It so happens that their headquarters are in Haifa. That has nothing to do actually with Zionism or anything, it's just a historical anomaly. But many of their leaders were close associates with the old regime. And so they have been denied legal rights, right to marriage, right to education, right to family life, everything, I mean, that you can think of, even burial. But there are other groups. I mean, for example, the Sabi'in are mentioned in the Quran as one of the groups that should be protected in Surah Al-Baqarah. But they're not amongst the recognized aqliyat. So why not? I did ask a senior member of Irshad, the Ministry of Guidance, as it's called, and he said, I don't know the answer to this question, because the Mandeans, the Christians of St. John the Baptist in Iran, are called Sabians, I mean, by everybody. So why are they not recognized?
They are recognized by the way, but they are part of the Chaldeans.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
they're
not
all
by
what?
name. They are part of the Chaldeans.
Yeah, but the Chaldeans are Christians, I mean, but they're not represented in parliament, for example.
They are.
So that's the, as far as I know, they've not been persecuted. And they are invited to conferences and things. But they are, if you restrict it to Jews, Christians, or Zoroastrians, then what about them? Then, of course, the biggest group that is not recognized are the growing numbers of people from the Shia, mainly the Shia Muslim community, who are becoming Christians. Now, I think it was when Ahmadinejad was the president, he enumerated the three main enemies of Iran. So America is one, Israel is another, and the house churches are the third. I mean, you might think, this is ridiculous, but that is the extent to which they fear the house churches. Now, it's interesting, I mean, compared to, say, Pakistan or Egypt, that they are not persecuted generally under the laws for apostasy, irtidad or rida, for example, or even the charge for blasphemy, gustakhi. But they tend to be persecuted for activity against the state or against national security. So any connection with an outside the group, a foreign group, is regarded as a security issue or activity against the state. So the judges who convict them in different parts of the country have no clear guideline about what to do with them. So they are convicted not under the hudud, that is to say, the punishments specified in the Quran or the Hadith, but they are convicted under this thing called Tazir. Tazir means punishment, but the judge then has the discretion to sentence them to whatever the judge feels is right. And this means there's wide variation. This is why you find some people are convicted for 5 years, sentenced to 5 years, some to 10 years, some to 15 years, and so on. Because of this discretion. Now, it's small comfort, but to say this, but in a way, this is not a bad thing, because it means that the hudud laws are not being applied. The from the very beginning, there were people who opposed this system of recognized and unrecognized minorities, who wanted to keep the system of common citizenship. And indeed, there were people in the Majlis of Obragan and the Assembly of Experts itself who said this. And they were not listened to. Also, very prominent people opposed theocracy. So Ayatollah Montazeri was the designated successor of Ayatollah Khomeini. But he opposed Khomeini on this very point of imposing theocracy. And he said that the role of the religious leaders should be to advise the government, not to impose its will on the government. He was also opposed to the barbaric and savage methods that the regime was using, particularly of mass execution. So he said in a letter to Khomeini, are we going to be known as the people who are constantly murdering people, who are constantly, the government that is filling cemeteries and so on. So very strong. For this, he was deposed, of course, as potential successor, put under house arrest. But there were others, Shariat Madari, for example, and Allama Tabatabai, one of the great learned scholars of Islam. They were all opposed to theocracy. And there were many others. Now, their students, etc., are still there in places like Qom, the center of his Shia learning. And I met many of them, and very interesting people. So that is one of the reasons for hope in Iran, is that it is not as monolithic as you might think. And underneath the civilization is there, which will prove, I think, in the end to be stronger than the kind of very superficial theocracy that is being enforced. There continue to be scholars who are opposed to theocracy and write about it. I mentioned some of them. Kadivar, who was a cleric himself, Surush, Shavistri, whom I have not written down yet, people who continue to provide an intellectual argument against theocracy in Iran. Now, this situation, if it's going to change, will change because of these people. I mean, mass protests, that's fine. That's, that's not fine. I mean, we can understand why they happen, but the ideological apparatus necessary for change will be found in such people. Because something will be needed. If you look at the history of Iran, Shia intellectual Islam has always played its due role, even in the Constitution of 1906, except under Raza Shah Pahlavi, except because he was gradually abandoning all of this. And the so-called White Revolution that he initiated in the 1960s was really one of the causes. The overthrow of Mossadegh was one. This was another of the causes of the so-called Islamic Revolution of 1979, 78, 79. the future, finally, of the unrecognized church, as it were, let's put it like that, let's borrow that term, in Iran. On the one hand, it is growing. So one of the results of the Islamic Revolution has been that there are now more Farsi-speaking Christians in the world and in Iran than there have ever been before in history. I mean, that's the paradox. In that sense, it's very like the situation in China. The church is growing, but there are some endemic problems. For example, that of the training of pastors, of leaders in the church. Some people are being brought out for periods. I've done this myself, for training, and then they go back. What happens to them when they go back is also very risky. I know that for a fact. It's not keeping up with the growth in the church and the imprisonment of its leaders. So there are scores of Christian leaders in prison today, scores of them, with different sentences that have been given. People are regularly leaving the country. You can't blame them for that. But many are not, and I mean the church, where was I reading that possibly it's about 1 million strong now? Does that sound reasonable to you, sir?
It's very difficult to say, but based on a survey in 2021, 1.5% they claim Christian. That means around 1.3 million.
Yeah, because the population at the moment is 91 million of Iran.
Who's
I was
counting?
thinking about 85 million.
No, it's now 91, almost 92.
Yeah, who's counting?
Yes.
Yeah, because this is the issue in China, it all depends on who's counting. And
No,
at least in China, it's a political number. So really, it's not a real
No,
number.
these are not Irani figures, these are international figures.
International figures, kind of looking at.
91.7, something like that.
But if Christians are underground and they're not surfacing, how?
But I think 1.5 is right. I mean,
The survey done by a group of scholars, researcher based in Netherlands, but they was online survey. In
Okay.
that 1.5, they say they are Christian. Only 40% they claim they are Muslims. Out of that 40%, only 32% Shia
Shia.
and 8% Sunni. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, that's about right. Of course, because it was online, many people would not have been reached and many
Yeah,
people
exactly.
wouldn't have declared.
Those majority of the young people.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
also.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a widespread reverence for Jesus in the culture, and that is very difficult to evaluate. I examined a thesis, an Australian thesis some years ago by an Irani student, and he had investigated the reasons that people give for becoming Christian. Very interesting reasons. Some of it has to do with the media, of course, Sarah knows about them. But some were a visit to an Armenian or Assyrian church as a child. Some was having Assyrian or Armenian neighbors. Some was, about the references to Jesus healing in the literature. There were a great variety of reasons that were given for people, by people. The phenomenon of dreams and visions and experiences of healing are a very real part of the growth, undoubtedly. And the government doesn't know how to deal with this. It is, very difficult. You can ban the Bible or whatever.
But not a dream.
Sorry for good prayer, good silent prayer.
Yeah, well, silent prayer is banned here,
Yeah.
But but there are some things. I mean, for example, the Catholic Church has produced a diatessaron in Farsi, which has been hugely popular because it fits in with the Islamic idea that there is one gospel. So if you produce a diatessaron, then you'll find that easier to read. The media, I mean, SAT7's ministry has been hugely, people, the radio ministry, for instance, I mean, they're reaching people you think was impossible to reach, even in prison. So that is having an effect. But I think generally, like in China, it is growing by one person dealing with another person and so on. But unlike China, it is a very urban phenomenon, at least I feel that.
Well, it's increasingly an urban phenomenon.
In China,
Yeah, it is flipped. So it was once a countryside thing. It's now almost totally, the great growth is in the city centers.
Yeah.
So the big cities.
How long a theocratic regime can survive is the question. What they have done is they have created a popular movement called the Basij. The Basijis are basically poor people who have been subjected to ideological brainwashing, let's put it. They were also used in the Iran-Iraq war as cannon fodder. The Revolutionary Guard, the Pasdaran Inqilab, the confiscated properties of the Shah and of wealthy people before the revolution and of Western interests and so on, has been invested by the Pasdaran in the Iranian bazaar, the Iranian market. And this means that there is a kind of a codependence of the Iranian market and the Revolutionary Guard, which means it is economically in the interests of the bazaar that the regime should survive. The IRGC has also basically sidelined the armed forces in terms of who takes the initiative, even during the Iran-Iraq war. But certainly in present circumstances, they are the sole vehicle for exporting the revolution to Syria, to Lebanon, to Iraq, and so on. One issue is the significance of the Shia. I think the West has consistently undervalued this. I mean, how many people knew, for example, that the majority of the population in Iraq was Shia before the fall of Saddam Hussein? Very few, but it is. Turkey, similarly, I think one day we will find out that there are many more Alawis in Turkey than we think. Because, and this is not an accident, this is because of taqiyya. This is because in certain circumstances they are permitted not to declare themselves. In Syria also, you saw what happened with the Druze yesterday, but Alawite resistance to a Sunni fundamentalist movement will continue, with or without the support of Iran. There is grounds for permanent tension between Afghanistan and Iran because of the Hazara, a Shia group that has been very badly persecuted in Afghanistan. The Shia population of Pakistan is about 20%. My own family belonged to this tradition. And Khomeini, of course, was Indian, you know that. And from Lucknow. Family was from Lucknow. So I mean, the Shia in India are a real cultural, if not military factor in my knowledge. Because quite a lot of Shia learning is based in places like Lucknow, Bareilly, and so.
Hyderabad as well.
Hyderabad is I don't know the South so well. So that is the situation with Iran, with Christians in Iran and other minorities. But it's time for feedback. Sarah, do you want to say something?
Oh, no, thank you so much for really this introduction. As you mentioned earlier, Iran is much more complex than really. And I was just thinking about the conversion, because Iranians being really open to conversion and multi-conversion things. You put Tawatawa'i there and Montazeri there. And I mean, in my view, one of the factors that Iranians are more open to this is because of understanding between Deen and Mazhab. Many Iranians unconsciously they know Deen and Mazhab are two different things, faith and religion. And you can have Mazhab without having faith. You can have faith without having Mazhab. And that is why sometimes some Iranians, they combine that. They keep one as Mazhab and then Christianity as Deen. And for example, Tabatabai, in his Tafsir of Quran, he talks about the difference between Deen and Mazhab. And again, this understanding the difference between Deen and Mazhab also has very much influenced the even jurisprudence understanding of conversion, apostasy. And then because again, depending how you perceive Deen, whether you have Islamic and Christian, some of the Muslim scholars, they see Christianity, Judaism, and Islam under one umbrella of divine faith, and then some they say no, there are three faiths, and then the other denomination can call Mazhab. This has been part of a kind of interesting, actually, when I did my PhD and then going through all this data. It's very fascinating. And for example, we had a converse, one of the converts I was interviewing, telling me he's converted to Christianity 2 years ago. But suddenly, and later on in this testimony says, I stopped praying namaz only 4 months ago. That's because it was in Arabic. He didn't see the clash between his conversion to Christianity and continuation of his mazhab. That was I mean, there are lots of very fascinating issues here. The only thing I wanted to add here is the bishop's his own involvement. Bishop, please correct me. Bishop, you were part of the dialogue between faith and civilization, which Khatami established. They are very. The regime was very strict and even accepting conversion. When Bishop was part of that delegation, I was thinking, says, would they accept him because he himself is a convert? To my surprise, you were not only accepted, you were very much respected. And that was also interesting. And as a result of those dialogues and meetings, there are, I mean, it's a very fascinating, actually, journey, how to be a very big institution established to study interfaith and religion, especially Christianity and Islam. And then out of that came lots of literatures, lots of books, lots of articles all about Christianity without any polemics. And during the Ahmadinejad, when the conversion grew, and they noticed some of the people who really converted to Christianity, they are pointing to those books, which was translated or published by the teams part of that. And that is why Ahmadinejad banned those books again to foreign countries. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, that is a very interesting episode. I didn't mention it myself, but there was a kind of spring under President Fatumi, and just before him as well, And it was resourced by the ulama, in Qom itself, which is the center of Shia learning. I mean, for example, in Qom, there is a man who has given all his scholarly life to the study of St. Thomas Aquinas. In the University of Tehran, there is a lay scholar who's given he's a specialist in St. Augustine of Hippo. So, there are people like that around. And Khatami had brought many of these people together. When he was president, he was holding court and I was there, and behind him was a verse from Rumi. So just as an opening, I said, this is a verse from Rumi, and I read it out. And one of his advisors immediately said, no, Bishop, they said, not Rumi, this is Saadi. So I said, okay, I shut up. So anyway, we talked, and then Khatami stopped the conversation. He said, look, the bishop is right, this is a verse. He came here, we entertained him for a whole day in the House of Lords. And he was then setting up that organization in Geneva that you were talking about. But then, and the translation work, the translation work was a little bit sort of random, let's put it like that. They were translating, for example, Paul Tillich, and I thought, well, why Tillich, and a lot of other things you could point to. But it was there, and the libraries were full of these books. But as you say, Ahmadinejad then stopped that. Some of it continued even under him, under the Sazman-e Farang-e Islami, man called Rasulipur, who continued some of that work. So I don't know how much is still there, but in the libraries of Qom it was there.
Yes, Tom. Then one of the things you didn't talk about in group of people, but very important, are people that were important throughout the whole region, let's stretch down the region. And that's the seculars, all right, and nationalists. So yeah, Ataturk, in Turkey, you have Gamal Nasser, you have Hafez Assad, others, and most Iranians I have known fall somewhere along that, especially intellectuals and that kind of thing, and technocrats. Where do they fit in? Are they nominal Shia or that kind of thing? And do they have a place and a role? Because it's a huge issue in China, because in fact the pendulum swings differently because you have Chinese, the political ideology of the party, but then you get things swinging back to the people who can build roads, who are intellectuals, who are doctors, lawyers. So where does that group fit in? And how does that all work out? And just to add on, also when these judges determine Tazir, is there a written law that they apply?
No, to answer that last one, it's the easier one to answer. Tazir is precisely that it's left to the discretion of the judge.
So they just interpret.
That's why you have this wide variety in sentencing. But in a way, it's a mercy also, because if they started to apply apostasy, apostasy was applied in one case only, as far as I know, the case of Sudman in Mashhad, where he was actually convicted and executed for apostasy. But it is not since.
Bishop, can I just remind you, the judges are normally judged based on the school of jurisprudence they are coming from.
The Asuli, yeah.
And then the school is very much linked to one of the grand ayatollahs. And depending on, for example, I'm from Kerman.
Yeah.
So the grand ayatollah, and where majority of the judges in Kerman they came from, was Ayatollah Mahaqiqi. Ayatollah Mahaqiqi do not see conversion from Christianity or any Abrahamic religion to from Islam to any Abrahamic religion as apostasy. So even when I was in prison several times, they did not have any could not keep me based on that, because in their jurisprudence, people moving between these three religions should not be seen apostasy.
I think that's very important. You should write an article on that.
Sure.
I mean, it's a very important
Exactly.
point. I think this is one of the reasons for Tazir, is not because there is disagreement about what is apostasy. I mean, on the other hand, there are some Ayatollahs who would regard even conversion to Sunni Islam as apostasy.
Yeah, Khalifa is one of
Yeah.
those who I was talking about, one of the scholars.
Yeah.
That is why he was kicked out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was himself.
Actually, I wanted to follow up on that, but in a different way. Thank you so much, Bishop. This is very interesting. This is fascinating, and thank you for sort of chipping in from time to time. I'm thinking here in terms of training the leaders, the church leaders,
Yeah.
in terms of things, which is one of the difficult things to do here. You've mentioned, especially looking at Iran in the context that it has been currently with the challenges of conflict that has been going on, and also the idea of God coming in from the US, God has helped win into this. Do you see this theocracy even losing its hold, or in fact it will become even much stronger in the future going forward? And how do you see the role of the church in equipping how should we in fact equip leadership for the context like Iran? Do we need different approaches, methods, and how do we engage with the intellectuals, Islamic intellectuals that have been resisting, that you've already mentioned, in that context, in the way we do training? Because sometimes I feel like, coming from a evangelical perspective, we want to do it from almost like opposing what is on the ground. If you believe that these intellectuals within have the potential for transformation of Iran, then how do we train those ministers to recognize that potential and engage with it in a much more sober, meaningful way as we think towards some form of reimagining of Iran?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. It depends what happens next. But I mean, my approach is opportunistic.
Okay.
So, if you are invited to Qom, go to Qom. Because unless you go, I mean, whatever the risk. The first time I went after the revolution to Iran, I think he was a Hujjatul Islam who gave me the visa. He said, because of your name, this is at your own risk. Okay. But then on another occasion, I was invited by the government. They gave me a driver. I know the driver was also a spy. And he asked me, and you have to accept these things. Another time, I went down to breakfast this is the Lale Hotel in Tehran. I went down to breakfast. I'd forgotten something, so I went back to my room, and there was a man fiddling with my light. So he said, "Oh, your light is not working at last. It's a kharab." So I said, "It's perfectly fine 5 minutes ago." So he was bugging the room.
That's right.
So then I went back another day, and there was a chap fiddling with the toilet. So this is, you have to accept this. So, I mean, under Khatami, there were huge opportunities, and let us pray that somebody else will. I mean, Pezeshkian had the possibility of being that kind of president. I don't know, after all of what's happened, whether that will continue or not. So the question of dialogue must remain open. Even if it's not in Iran, it may be somewhere else. I mean, not necessarily in Iran.
And really, the dialogue also, it is important to be with also the intellectuals, doesn't
Yeah.
matter, government.
True.
For example, we were talking about Baha'i. The largest minority groups in Iran are Baha'i. though they may, I mean,
Yeah.
government doesn't, but in reality, they are everywhere. And we don't, tell anyone, for example, they doing their own business, they doing, even they are in university and everywhere, but people hide, protect them, it is, and then people start, majority of the people sometimes online who are speaking for Baha'i, they are not Baha'i themselves. They are, and that is why we need our Christians, they need to do the same thing, encourage that. For example, like Kadivar, what the Kadivar and the group, what they did, they because in the past, no one would dare to say the conversion should be allowed, and converts are not apostate. And then Kadivar and a group of people, they start saying that, but they pay the price, but they open the path for other people to speak. Says, okay, no, conversion should be free, and everyone has the rights to choose their own religion. And that kind of things, the dialogue, if it started from within the society, then the government has no choice to change some of their ways. And then we see that within the Iranian communities, but sadly, Christians and especially converts do not look into the Iranian society. Baha'is, they do more than the Iranians they do, the Christians they do. We look into the West as our saviors, not really into our own societies. And I think we need to learn that. And I always try to encourage my fellow Christians, though they don't like it when I'm talking about these things. As a Christian convert and the new emerging church, Shiism has a huge things for us to learn. And because how the Shiism tailor-made for the Iranians, you cannot become Shia without awareness of the Iran and the Iranian culture of these days. And then we can learn from that how to contextualize that and look inward to ourselves rather than to the West.
I think this is absolutely right. I mean, yeah, so just to answer your question, I mean, so dialogue obviously is one. The media remains very important because it's now been shown that the government cannot block it out. But the media is itself a double-edged sword. So it can produce good things, but also bad things. And one of the points that Dr. Sara has just mentioned is the question of inculturation. So the house churches are getting their inspiration from the West, whether you like it or not. That is how to inculturate. You see, what you have is you have the Chaldeans and the Assyrians and the Armenians who are rooted in their own language, their own culture, their own liturgies, and so on. And the government does not mind that because none of that is accessible to Farsi-speaking people generally, although I was told that some Farsi-speaking people are even so desperate they're going to these other churches, pretending to be part of those communities. And they've learned a few words of the languages, because there are people outside watching who goes in. So the inculturation of the house churches is very important. And the media generally, not just social media, the media generally can promote this by modeling it in different ways.
Quick one for Michael, but you never answered the one on the modernists. So you touched on the legal side, but in terms of the Middle East,
Oh, the secular.
the secular, where do they fit?
Okay, I'll come back to the may I just finish the games thing. So the other thing is to train the trainers. So there are people engaged, well or badly engaged in training people who are brought out and then sandbag and so on. We have to improve the quality of what is happening. particularly, I mean, in terms of theological rigor, of course, as well, but also in terms of questions like enculturation, awareness of Iranian civilization, of history, and all of those things, how that relates to the Bible. I mean, there are large parts of the Bible that you cannot understand without knowing about Persian civilization. Yes, said. So there is ample grounds for this. But training the trainer. So for OCMS, for example, I would say concentrate on identifying. I mean, we've got a student at the moment that you mentioned just now, who is a potential trainer of trainers, but he is an actual trainer of trainers. That can be multiplied in different ways, not just people ethnically from Iran or Iranian background, but other people also who are committed in terms of mission to this kind of calling. On secularity as an attitude, as a mindset, many, of course, people like that. There were many people like that who left Iran. But generally speaking, I don't know what Sarah thinks about this. Generally speaking, I have found that the Irani people are a spiritual people. They may not identify with a particular religious system. Increasingly, that's not the case if these surveys are correct. But they remain spiritual. And one of the reasons I think that the Christianity is growing is because of the spiritual hunger. Somehow it has to be satisfied. You know, the Christian faith and practice is one of the ways of doing that. I think one of the disservices that the Shah performed, as it were, for Iran was to turn its orientation westwards. This is still rooted in many people's minds, especially the more urbanized people. And it is very tragic, actually. I mean, I was in Tehran once when the British Museum had lent to the National Museum in Tehran the cylinder of Cyrus, you know, which proclaimed. So I was in a meeting with Ershad, actually, and so I said, what a great tradition of religious tolerance Iran has, and you know, this cylinder of Cyrus basically. And the man who was chairing the meeting was a senior official of Ershad, actually he was a minister, he was the deputy minister. He said, oh, we're not interested in the past, we're only interested in what happens in the future with the coming of the Mahdi. The coming of the Imam, return of the Imam. Now, if this becomes widespread in the culture, this will be very tragic for them. It could deracinize the whole people. To some extent, I mean, Iranian civilizational pull is very strong, but it could happen. I mean, it's happened in this country, so why can't it happen in Iran?
That's good news.
Yes, Andrew.
Bishop Michael, that person who met you at the airport and took you out to another door was an angel, literally, literally an angel. They are sent to help God's people in time of need. Elaine and I met one 2 years ago at Easter. We'll tell you the story some other time, but that was an angel. And I'd like to know how the recording of this can be accessed, please. If someone maybe could send me an email, obviously an edited recording, but it would be very helpful to have the recording because there are 1 or 2 people I know who'll be very, very interested to hear what you've said.
So after the editing, Chris, it's going to be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and I'll request Sonia to send you an email with the link so you can access it too easily.
Many thanks. Many thanks.
That's only the talk. Only the talk.
Only the talk. After appropriate editing. Yeah, which Sarah can do. I mean, she's quite capable of handling these things. So I think with that, we need to end this lecture, and with this lecture, this series on meekness and faith as polity also ends. So that this was my last responsibility. And it has ended well with Bishop Michael's lecture. I have to say, I mean, there's potential for us to organize a series of maybe 4 or 3 lecture series. There are 17 papers here, including Bishop Michael's and Amir's, but I haven't got time for that.
You still have time, man. That's not created.
Let's give a big hand to.
Good. Well, that's cool.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you, Bishop.
That's all. Been active.
Yeah, I think that's good to have.
Good to have this.
Thank you, everybody online. We appreciate it.
Couple of references, Sabi.